The mountain man's hands were still bleeding when he carried her stepfather out of the flames. Mara had watched Gideon Vale disappear into that collapsing inferno, knowing she might never see him alive again. The man who had promised no one would ever love her the way he did. The man she had been too afraid to love back until it was almost too late. But this story doesn't start with fire. It starts with dust, humiliation, and a woman who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes survival means making yourself so small the world forgets you exist. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The bread was burning. Mara Ellison could smell it, even before the acrid smoke began curling from the ancient oven's seams. But her hands had gone numb again, that dead, distant feeling that crept up her fingers whenever she let herself think too much. She blinked hard, forcing herself back into her body, and grabbed the wooden peel with movements that had become automatic over the last 3 years. The loaves came out dark, too dark. The crusts had gone from golden to mahogany, edging toward black in places where the heat distributed unevenly. They'd still be edible, still taste fine to most people, but Mara knew the difference. She always knew. "Damn it," she whispered to the empty bakery. Outside, Red Flint was waking up the way it always did. Slowly, reluctantly, like a man nursing a hangover he'd earned and deserved. The wind had already started, that constant prairie companion that scraped across the flats and sent dust devils spinning through the unpaved streets. By midday, it would be howling. By evening, it would die down to a sullen moan that leaked through every crack in every building, a sound so familiar that most people had stopped hearing it years ago. Mara heard everything. She set the burned loaves aside and checked the next batch, her practiced eye scanning for the telltale signs of perfection. The precise shade of brown, the way the crust crackled when she tapped it, the hollow sound that meant the interior had risen properly. These were good. These would do. The bakery had been her father's before it became hers. Thomas Ellison had built it with his own hands 20 years ago, back when Red Flint still had aspirations of becoming something more than a forgotten supply stop between actual towns. The building sat on the eastern edge of what passed for Main Street, a squat structure of weathered wood and river stone that had somehow outlasted half the businesses that once surrounded it. Inside, it was exactly 14 feet wide and 30 feet deep. Mara knew because she'd measured it once during a particularly long winter, desperate for something to occupy her mind beyond the endless routine of mixing, kneading, baking, selling, cleaning, sleeping. The front half served as the shop, a single long counter, shelves for the day's offerings, a window that looked out onto the street. The back half belonged to the work, the oven her father had mortgaged their house to buy, the wide wooden table scarred with decades of use, the carefully organized stations where flour, sugar, salt, and yeast waited in their proper containers. It smelled like every good thing Mara had ever known: yeast and butter, cinnamon and honey, the dark, almost bitter scent of rye, the sweet warmth of fresh bread that made people's faces soften even when they'd come in wearing their hardest expressions. The bell above the door chimed. Mara didn't turn around immediately. She finished checking the oven temperature, adjusted the damper, and only then allowed herself to look toward the entrance. Margaret Chen stood just inside the doorway, her market basket already half full with whatever she'd picked up from the general store. She was one of Mara's regulars, a small, efficient woman in her 50s who ran the boarding house on 2nd Street and who had never once in 3 years asked Mara a personal question. "Morning," Margaret said. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen. The usual? 2 loaves of the wheat, and if you have any of those raisin rolls left from yesterday, I made fresh ones this morning." Mara was already moving, wrapping the bread in clean cloth, counting out 6 rolls into a paper bag. "Anything else?" "That'll do." Margaret set exact change on the counter while Mara packaged everything. Their transaction took less than 2 minutes, executed with the practiced efficiency of a ritual performed countless times. Margaret paused at the door. "Storm coming," she said, not quite looking at Mara. "Radio says it'll hit by noon. Big one." "I heard." Mara had heard. She always listened to the weather reports, planned her deliveries around them, structured her entire existence around avoiding unnecessary risk. "Be careful out there." Then Margaret was gone, and Mara was alone again with the bread and the wind and the particular quality of silence that filled the spaces between customers. The morning progressed in its usual pattern. Thomas Burke came in for his daily biscuit, said nothing, left his nickel, and departed. The Kowalski twins appeared with their mother's shopping list and their mother's money, purchased a week's worth of bread in about 10 different varieties, and argued good-naturedly about which of them had to carry the heavy basket home. By 10 o'clock, Mara had sold roughly half her morning's production and needed to start on the afternoon batch. But first came the deliveries. She dreaded the deliveries. Not the work itself. The loading of the cart, the navigation of Red Flint's rutted streets, the dropping off of pre-ordered goods at houses and businesses around town. That part was fine. Simple. Predictable. It was the visibility that made her skin crawl. The way she became a public figure the moment she stepped outside, pushing her wooden cart with its squeaking wheel that she'd been meaning to oil for 6 months. The way people looked at her, or deliberately didn't look at her. The way certain groups of men would go quiet when she passed, a silence that felt worse than any words. But the deliveries paid better than walk-in sales. Mrs. Patterson at the hotel bought 3 dozen rolls every Thursday. The Miners Association ordered bread for their weekly meetings. The restaurant on 4th Street took whatever she couldn't sell elsewhere. Mara loaded the cart systematically, wrapping each order in cloth marked with the customer's name. The wind had picked up significantly, and the sky to the west had taken on that peculiar yellow-gray color that meant Margaret Chen's storm warning hadn't been exaggerated. She should wait it out, stay inside, make the deliveries tomorrow. But tomorrow the bread would be stale, and Mrs. Patterson would complain, and the restaurant might start buying from the new bakery that had opened in Cooperton, 15 miles south. 3 years of running this business alone had taught Mara that survival meant keeping promises even when circumstances made it difficult. She tied her bonnet tighter, gripped the cart's handles, and stepped into the wind. Red Flint looked different from street level than it did from her bakery window. Smaller, somehow. More vulnerable. The buildings seemed to hunch against the coming storm, and the few people still outside moved with urgent purpose toward shelter. Mara kept her head down and pushed. The cart's bad wheel caught on every uneven patch of ground, jerking the handles in her grip. By the time she'd made her first 3 stops, her shoulders ached and her palms had developed fresh blisters on top of old calluses. But she kept going, checking items off her mental list, collecting payment, offering minimal conversation. She was halfway to the hotel when she saw them. 4 men, mid-20s, leaning against the wall of what had once been a hardware store and was now just another empty building with broken windows. Mara recognized 2 of them, Jake Morrison and Ben Curtis, both of whom had been in her grade at school before she'd stopped attending. The others were unfamiliar, probably ranch hands from one of the spreads outside town. She could cross the street, take the long way around to the hotel. But that would mean backtracking 2 blocks, and the sky was getting darker by the minute, and she was so tired of being afraid. Mara straightened her spine and kept pushing the cart forward. "Well, look who it is." Jake Morrison's voice carried easily over the wind. "Red Flint's finest businesswoman." The others laughed. Mara kept walking. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Mara." She was almost past them. 10 more feet and she'd be clear. "What's wrong? Too good to talk to old friends?" This was Ben Curtis, pushing off the wall, taking a step toward the street. "We used to be real friendly, didn't we? Remember that night after the harvest dance?" Mara's hands tightened on the cart handles. Of course she remembered. The whole town remembered. The night when 16-year-old Mara Ellison had been stupid enough to believe that Ben Curtis's attention meant something other than a bet with his friends. The night she'd let him walk her home, let him kiss her behind the church, let herself imagine for one brief, beautiful moment that maybe someone could actually want her. Until his friends had appeared, laughing, demanding to know if Ben had managed to bag the baker's charity case. Until she'd understood that she'd never been anything but a joke to them. 7 years later, and they still thought it was funny. "I have deliveries," Mara said quietly. "Excuse me." "Deliveries," Jake repeated mockingly. "So important. So serious." "Leave her alone, Jake." This was a new voice, one of the unfamiliar ranch hands, younger than the others, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation. "Why? We're just having a conversation, aren't we, Mara?" The wind gusted hard, and a loose shutter somewhere nearby banged repeatedly against a wall. Mara could smell rain in the air now, that particular petrichor scent that preceded desert storms. "I really need to go," she said. She meant to sound firm, but it came out pleading, and she hated herself for it. Ben stepped fully into her path now. He wasn't touching her, wasn't technically doing anything wrong, but his presence there was a wall she'd have to navigate around or through. "You know what I never understood?" he said, conversationally. "Why you still live here? Your dad's been gone, what, 3 years? And you stay in this shithole town with a stepdaddy who treats you like hired help and a mama who won't even look you in the eye. Why's that, Mara?" Because she had nowhere else to go. Because her father's death had left debts she was still paying off. Because the bakery was the only thing she knew how to do, and Red Flint was the only place she knew how to be. But she didn't say any of that. "Please move," she said instead. "Please move," Jake mimicked in a high-pitched voice that sounded nothing like her. "Jesus, you're still the same scared little mouse you always were." Something inside Mara cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of ice forming on a winter pond. "Get out of my way," she said. And this time her voice was flat, empty of everything except exhaustion. "I'm done talking to you." She pushed the cart forward. Ben had to step aside or get hit. He chose to step aside, but he made sure she felt his anger as she passed. "Bitch," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Mara didn't react. She just kept pushing the cart, kept moving forward, kept breathing despite the tightness in her chest that made every inhalation feel like work. She made it another block before the first tears came. Not sobs, not any kind of crying that would be visible to anyone watching, just tears that leaked from the corners of her eyes and got swept away immediately by the wind. She wiped at them impatiently with the back of one hand while the other maintained its death grip on the cart. Stupid. She was stupid to let them get to her, stupid to still care after all these years. Stupid to think that keeping her head down and working hard would ever be enough to make this town forget what she was. Thomas Ellison's orphaned daughter, living off charity in a house where she'd never be wanted, running a business that barely broke even most months. The hotel loomed ahead. Mara blinked away the last of the tears and focused on the immediate task. Mrs. Patterson would be waiting. The bread needed to be delivered. Everything else could wait. She made her delivery, collected her payment, and checked her list. 2 more stops, both on the eastern edge of town where houses gave way to prairie and the wind hit with nothing to slow it down. The storm was coming faster than predicted. The sky had gone from yellow-gray to a deep, bruised purple, and the wind was starting to gust in irregular patterns that made the cart difficult to control. Mara knew she should turn back, but she was closer to her final destinations than to the bakery, and these customers had paid in advance. She pushed on. The restaurant took their delivery without comment. 1 stop left. The Hendersons lived in a small ranch house about a quarter mile past the official town limits, just far enough out that making deliveries to them was always slightly inconvenient. But Mr. Henderson tipped well, and he'd been one of her father's best friends, and Mara had never seriously considered cutting them from her route. She was halfway there when the storm hit. Not gradually, not with warning. One moment she was pushing the cart along the dirt road with the wind at her back, and the next moment the world disappeared into a wall of dust and debris that reduced visibility to approximately 3 feet. Mara stopped immediately, instinctively crouching lower as the wind tried to rip her bonnet off. She couldn't see the town behind her, couldn't see the road ahead, couldn't see anything except the brownish-red chaos that swirled around her like a living thing. The cart was already trying to tip over. She grabbed for it, but the wind was too strong, the cart too top-heavy with its remaining bread. It went over sideways with a crash she barely heard over the howl of the storm, and suddenly bread was everywhere, rolling across the dirt, getting picked up by the wind, disappearing into the dust. "No, no, no!" Mara lunged after the closest loaves, managed to grab 2 before they vanished completely. Something hit her in the back, a piece of tumbleweed or debris, she couldn't tell. She stumbled, nearly fell, caught herself with one hand while clutching bread against her chest with the other. This was bad. This was genuinely dangerous. She needed shelter, needed to get out of the storm, needed to... Through the chaos, a shape appeared. At first, Mara thought it was a building, some structure she'd somehow gotten turned around and wandered close to. But then the shape resolved into something else. Someone else. A man. Massive. Moving toward her through the dust storm like it was nothing more than a mild breeze. Mara's first instinct was fear. Out here, alone, with visibility at zero and a stranger approaching. Every warning her mother had ever given her, every lesson the last 7 years had taught, screamed at her to run. But she couldn't run, could barely stand against the wind. The man reached her. He was enormous, at least 6.5 feet tall, built like he'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains visible to the north on clear days. His face was weathered and hard, his eyes a pale gray that seemed to see everything and show nothing. He wore a heavy coat despite the heat, and his dark hair whipped around his face in the wind. He didn't say anything, just reached down, grabbed Mara's overturned cart with one hand like it weighed nothing, and righted it. Then he started gathering bread. Mara watched, stunned into immobility, as this stranger moved through the storm collecting her scattered inventory with the efficiency of someone performing a familiar task. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just worked, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he wrapped loaves and placed them back in the cart. When he'd recovered everything salvageable, he finally looked at her directly. "Get behind it," he said. His voice was deep, rough, like he didn't use it often. "What?" "Behind the cart. I'll push. You steer." Mara found herself obeying before her brain caught up with her body. She moved to the front of the cart while the stranger positioned himself at the back, and together they began pushing back toward town. It shouldn't have worked. The wind was too strong, the cart too unwieldy. But with the stranger's strength behind it and Mara guiding from the front, they made steady progress through the storm. 5 minutes. 10. Mara lost track of time in the dust and noise. Her world narrowed to the next step, the next push, the constant effort of keeping the cart moving in approximately the right direction. Then, suddenly, the buildings of Red Flint's eastern edge appeared out of the chaos. The stranger pushed the cart all the way to her bakery door. Only then did he step back, his job apparently complete. Mara turned to look at him, and for the first time in years found herself at a complete loss for words. He was real. Not a hallucination brought on by panic, not some trick of the storm. A real man who had appeared out of nowhere, helped her without being asked, and now stood there looking at her with those strange pale eyes that held something she couldn't quite identify. Not pity, not mockery, not expectation, just seeing, like he saw her as an actual person rather than a collection of assumptions and old gossip. "Thank you," Mara managed. Thank you. Can I give you some bread as payment? I have money inside if you'd rather." "No need." His voice was still rough, but there was something almost gentle in it. "Get inside before it gets worse." He started to turn away. "Wait," Mara said, surprising herself. "What's your name?" The man paused. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "Gideon," he said finally. "Gideon Vale." Then he walked back into the storm, and within seconds the dust had swallowed him completely, like he'd never been there at all. Mara stood in her bakery doorway for a long moment, staring at the place where he'd disappeared. Around her the storm raged, battering the town with wind and dust and debris. Inside she was perfectly still. Gideon Vale. She knew that name. Everyone in Red Flint knew that name, though most people only spoke it in whispers. The mountain man. The widower. The recluse who lived somewhere up on Iron Ridge and came into town maybe twice a year for supplies, always alone, always silent, always radiating an aura of "don't talk to me," so powerful that even the pushiest gossips gave him space. There were stories about him. His wife and children had died years ago. 10 years? 15? In some kind of raid or attack. He'd been gone when it happened, away hunting or working or something, and he'd come home to find them dead. The grief had broken him. He'd buried them himself, sold the ranch he'd been building, and disappeared into the mountains. Some people said he was dangerous. Others said he was just sad. A few claimed to have seen him watching the town from the ridge on clear days, though Mara had always assumed those stories were exaggerated. But he was real, and he had helped her. Mara pulled the cart fully inside and locked the door behind her. The bakery felt smaller than usual. The familiar space somehow changed by what had just happened outside. She began unpacking the cart, checking each loaf for damage. Most of them were fine, dusty, but structurally sound. A few would need to be discounted. 2 were complete losses. Her hands were shaking. Mara set down the bread she was holding and pressed her palms flat against the wooden counter, forcing herself to breathe slowly and deliberately. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the technique her father had taught her when she was small and prone to panic. She was fine. She was safe. The storm was outside and she was inside, and nothing bad had actually happened, except that she'd been helped by a stranger who hadn't wanted anything in return, who hadn't made her feel small or stupid or obligated, who had simply done what needed doing and then left. When was the last time that had happened? Mara couldn't remember. The storm lasted through the afternoon and into the evening. Mara worked through it automatically, cleaning the dusty bread, baking the next day's inventory, going through all the motions of her daily routine. But her mind kept circling back to those few minutes on the road, the way Gideon Vale had moved through the storm like it was nothing, the surprising gentleness of his large hands as he'd gathered her bread, the complete absence of judgment in his expression when he'd looked at her. That last part kept catching her. She was so used to being looked at with pity or contempt or mild annoyance, the way people in Red Flint looked at problems they'd rather not deal with but felt obligated to acknowledge. Gideon hadn't looked at her like that at all. Around 7 o'clock, the wind finally began to die down. Mara locked up the bakery and walked the 6 blocks to what had once been her family home and was now Harold Gentry's house, where she was permitted to live in exchange for cooking, cleaning, and staying out of the way. The house looked the same as always, a modest 2-story structure that her father had maintained meticulously and Harold had let slide into gentle disrepair. Paint peeling from the shutters, porch steps that needed replacing, a general air of entropy that made Mara's chest hurt every time she saw it. She let herself in through the back door. "You're late." Harold's voice came from the front room where he spent his evenings drinking and reading week-old newspapers. "Dinner should have been ready an hour ago." "There was a storm," Mara said quietly, hanging her bonnet on its hook. "I got delayed." "I heard the storm. I still got hungry at 6 like I do every day." Mara's mother appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Sarah Gentry, formerly Sarah Ellison, looked older than her 48 years, worn down by circumstances and choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had hardened into a kind of perpetual regret. "I started dinner," Sarah said, not quite meeting Mara's eyes. "The roast just needs another 20 minutes. "Thank you," Mara said. Sarah nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. She'd been disappearing like that for 3 years now, physically present but emotionally absent, existing in the same spaces as her daughter while maintaining a careful distance that prevented any actual connection. Mara understood. Her mother had remarried 6 months after her father died, driven by panic and financial necessity to accept Harold Gentry's proposal. Harold owned the feed store, had a steady income, and was willing to take on a widow with a 20-year-old daughter who came with a failing business and significant debt. It had been a practical decision. Sarah had chosen survival over sentiment, and Mara couldn't entirely fault her for it. But she also couldn't forgive the way Sarah had folded into herself afterward, becoming smaller and quieter with each passing month until she was barely a person at all. Just a collection of apologetic gestures and averted eyes. "I'm going upstairs," Mara said. "Call me when dinner's ready." She climbed to her room, the smallest bedroom on the 2nd floor, barely large enough for a single bed and a dresser, with a window that looked out over the alley. It had been her room her entire life, but since Harold moved in, it had started to feel less like home and more like a cell she was permitted to occupy. Mara sat on the bed and finally let herself shake. The storm. The men outside the empty building. The overwhelming fear when the dust wall hit. And then Gideon Vale, appearing like something out of the stories her father used to tell, the mysterious stranger who shows up exactly when needed and disappears just as quickly. Except he was real, and he lived 20 miles north on Iron Ridge, and he probably helped her for the same reason anyone helped anyone, because it was the decent thing to do, not because she was special or interesting or worth noticing. She needed to stop thinking about it. Mara lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, counting water stains until her mother called her down for dinner. The next morning began exactly like every morning before it. Mara woke at 4, dressed in the dark, and walked through the silent house to the bakery. She lit the oven, mixed her doughs, and began the familiar rhythm of work that structured her entire existence. By the time the sun came up, she had 24 loaves cooling and a batch of cinnamon rolls ready for the morning rush. The bell chimed at 6:30. Margaret Chen, right on schedule, purchasing her usual order with her usual efficiency. "Heard you got caught in the storm yesterday," Margaret said as Mara wrapped her bread. Of course she'd heard. Everyone had probably heard by now. "I made it back fine," Mara said. "Someone said they saw Gideon Vale in town. First time in months." Margaret's tone was carefully neutral. "Funny timing." Mara said nothing. She'd learned years ago that the best response to fishing expeditions was no response at all. Margaret accepted her wrapped bread and her lack of gossip with equal grace and departed, leaving Mara alone with her thoughts and her cooling loaves. The day progressed normally. Customers came and went. Mara baked, sold, cleaned, and tried very hard not to think about gray eyes and the sound of her name spoken without mockery. She almost succeeded. At 3 o'clock, she was cleaning the front counter when she noticed something on the windowsill outside, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Mara glanced up and down the empty street, then unlocked the door and retrieved the package. Inside the cloth were 6 perfect pine cones, still fragrant with sap, and a cluster of wildflowers she didn't recognize. Delicate blue petals on thin green stems that must have grown somewhere high up where the air was cooler and the soil different from the dust plains around Red Flint. There was no note, no signature, no indication of who had left them or why. But Mara knew. She stood in her bakery doorway, holding flowers and pine cones, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the sensation. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone had thought about her. Not as a problem or an obligation or a punchline to an old joke, just as a person worth giving flowers to. Mara took the bundle inside and set it on the shelf behind the counter where she could see it while she worked. Then she went back to baking, her hands steady and her heart beating just slightly faster than normal. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it sounded different. Less like a warning, more like a conversation she was only beginning to learn how to hear. The flowers lasted 5 days before they started to wilt. Mara kept them anyway, tucked in a glass of water behind the counter where she could see them between customers. She told herself it didn't mean anything. People left things sometimes, forgotten items, small tokens of appreciation. This was no different, except it was different, and she knew it. On the 6th day after the storm, Mara found another bundle on her windowsill. This time it was a smooth riverstone, gray as winter clouds, with a perfect spiral fossil embedded in its surface. The kind of thing that took thousands of years to form and mere seconds to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Someone had been paying attention. She held the stone in her palm, feeling its weight, tracing the fossil's curves with one fingertip. Then she placed it next to the pine cones on her shelf and went back to kneading dough with hands that trembled just slightly. 2 days later, a small carved figure appeared. A rough wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb, whittled with more care than skill. The proportions were slightly wrong, the wings asymmetrical, but something about its imperfection made it more precious than any store-bought trinket could have been. Mara was starting to understand that these weren't random gifts. They were a language she was only beginning to learn how to read. The question was what to say back. She spent an entire afternoon debating with herself while she worked. Leave something in return? Ignore it and hope the gifts continued? Try to catch whoever was leaving them, even though she already knew who it was? In the end, she decided on honesty. That evening, instead of going straight to Harold's house after closing, Mara wrapped 2 loaves of fresh bread, 1 honey wheat, 1 rosemary olive, in clean cloth and tied them with string. She placed the bundle on the same windowsill where the gifts had appeared, then stepped back and looked at it critically. It seemed like too little, too ordinary. What was bread compared to fossils and hand-carved birds? But bread was what she had to give. Bread was what she knew how to make well, and maybe that would be enough. She walked home through the purple evening light, trying not to think about whether he would come, whether he would understand what she meant, whether this entire thing was just her imagination constructing meaning from coincidence. The next morning, the bread was gone. In its place sat a cluster of sage, still fragrant, tied with a piece of rough twine. Mara stood in her doorway and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The gifts continued. Small things, always appearing when she wasn't looking. A hawk feather. 3 smooth pebbles arranged in a careful line. Wild herbs she couldn't identify. Once, inexplicably, a perfect robin's egg, empty but unbroken, its blue shell catching the morning light like a piece of sky that had fallen to earth. And Mara responded the only way she knew how, with bread. Not just any bread. She started baking specifically for these exchanges, putting extra care into each loaf. Honey oat rolls on Tuesdays, dark rye with caraway on Thursdays, sweet braided challah on Saturdays. Each one wrapped carefully, left on the windowsill like an offering to a god she'd just discovered existed. They never saw each other, never spoke, never acknowledged what was happening in any direct way. But 3 weeks after the storm, Mara realized she was thinking about Gideon Vale more than she thought about anything else, wondering what he did all day up on Iron Ridge, whether he liked the bread she left, whether he thought about her at all, or if this was just something he did, left gifts for people the way some men collected rocks or studied birds, a hobby that meant nothing beyond the moment. She was still wondering when he appeared in her bakery. It was early afternoon on a Tuesday, the quiet time between the lunch rush and the evening stragglers. Mara was restocking shelves when the bell chimed, and she turned expecting Margaret Chen or one of the Kowalski twins. Instead, Gideon Vale stood just inside her doorway, so large he made the already small space feel microscopic. Mara's first thought was that something was wrong. Her second thought was that she'd forgotten how tall he was, how his presence seemed to fill a room not through aggression, but through sheer physical existence. Her third thought was that she had flour on her face, and her hair was a mess, and why did that matter? "Mr. Vale," she managed. He nodded once, a slight dip of his chin that might have been a greeting or might have been acknowledgement that she'd spoken. Silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either, just 2 people looking at each other, trying to figure out what came next. "The bread," Gideon said finally. "It's good." "Thank you." Mara's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm glad I hope you—" She stopped, frustrated with herself. "You didn't have to bring those things, the gifts, but I appreciated them." Another nod. He was looking at her shelf now, where the pine cones and stone and wooden bird were displayed like treasures in a museum. "You kept them," he observed. "Of course I kept them." The words came out sharper than she'd meant. "They're beautiful. Why wouldn't I keep them?" Something shifted in Gideon's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes that suggested he was pleased. "Most people wouldn't want things off the mountain. They think it's cursed, bad luck." "Do you believe that?" "No." He said it with absolute certainty. "The mountain's just a mountain. People need someone to blame for their troubles, so they blame the land. Easier than looking at themselves." Mara found herself nodding. She understood that impulse more than she wanted to admit. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, gesturing toward the shelves of bread and pastries. "Something to eat? I have fresh raisin scones, or if you prefer—" "I'm fine." Gideon shifted his weight, and Mara got the sense he was uncomfortable being inside, surrounded by walls. "I wanted to ask you something." "Yes?" "The Autumn Festival. Next month. You going?" Mara blinked, thrown by the question. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it." This was a lie. She thought about the festival every year, and every year decided against going. Too many people. Too many opportunities to be reminded of her place in the town's social hierarchy. Too many memories of harvest dances and stupid girls who believe stupid things about stupid boys. "You should go," Gideon said. "Why?" The question came out before Mara could stop it. Gideon looked at her directly, those pale gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because you spend too much time alone in this bakery. Because you're young, and you should be around people your own age. Because hiding from life doesn't make it hurt less." Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Mara had carefully constructed about herself. "You're one to talk," she said, and immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "You're right." Gideon's expression didn't change. "I'm the last person who should give advice about living, but that doesn't make the advice wrong." He turned toward the door, and Mara felt a sudden panic that if he left now, whatever fragile thing was building between them would shatter. "Wait," she said. Gideon paused. "Are you going? To the festival?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, "I wasn't planning to." "But if I went," Mara heard herself say, "would you?" The silence that followed felt enormous. Mara's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Yeah," Gideon said finally. "I would." Then he left, and Mara stood alone in her bakery, wondering what the hell she'd just done. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange blur of anticipation and dread. Mara found herself thinking about the festival constantly, what she'd wear, what she'd say, how she'd explain to Harold and her mother why she suddenly wanted to attend an event she'd avoided for years. In the end, she didn't explain at all. She just announced at dinner one evening that she'd be going to the festival and would be home late. Harold grunted his acknowledgement while reading his newspaper. Sarah looked up briefly, something flickering across her face that might have been concern or might have been relief, then went back to pushing peas around her plate. That was the sum total of their interest in Mara's life. The gifts continued. Mara responded with increasingly elaborate bread, braided loaves shaped like wreaths, rolls studded with dried fruit and nuts, a spectacular cinnamon babka that took her 3 hours to make and came out looking like something from a professional bakery in a real city. She still never saw him leave them or pick them up. But she started to notice small things around town. Gideon's wagon parked briefly outside the general store, always early morning when few people were around. A glimpse of his tall figure disappearing around a corner. The sense that he was nearby, keeping a careful distance but not quite leaving. Margaret Chen noticed too. "Seems like Gideon Vale's been in town more often lately," she remarked one morning while picking up her bread. Her tone was carefully neutral, but her eyes were sharp. "I wouldn't know," Mara said, wrapping the loaves with more concentration than the task required. "Mm-hmm." Margaret counted out her change. "Funny thing, though, last time he spent this much time in Red Flint was right after his family died. Then he disappeared for 10 years. Makes you wonder what could bring a man like that back around." Mara said nothing. Margaret took her bread and left, and Mara spent the rest of the day trying not to analyze what that conversation had really been about. The day of the autumn festival dawned clear and cold. Mara woke before her alarm, nervous energy making sleep impossible. She spent extra time getting ready, washing her hair with the good soap she saved for special occasions, putting on her nicest dress, a dark blue cotton that had been her mother's once, and still fit reasonably well. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror above her dresser and saw a woman she barely recognized. Not beautiful exactly, but not the ghost she'd become either. Just someone trying, which felt like more than she'd managed in years. The festival was held in the town square, such as it was, a patch of packed dirt surrounded by Red Flint's most prominent buildings, decorated for the occasion with strings of paper lanterns and bunting left over from Independence Day. By the time Mara arrived at 6, the celebration was already in full swing. People everywhere. Music coming from a makeshift stage where local musicians were doing their best impression of a proper band. The smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, and the particular dust that never quite left Red Flint no matter how much rain they got. Mara stood at the edge of the square and fought the urge to turn around and go home. "Mara Ellison." A familiar voice made her turn. "I'll be damned. You actually came." Thomas Burke stood a few feet away, holding a cup of what was probably not just cider. He was in his 60s, a retired rancher who'd known her father and had always been kind to Mara in his gruff, uncomfortable way. "Mr. Burke," Mara said, "none of that Mr. business. You're not 12 anymore." He gestured toward the festivities. "You here alone?" Yes, for now." Thomas studied her with eyes that had spent decades reading livestock and weather and people with equal accuracy. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded and took a sip of his not cider. "Good," he said. "About time you stopped hiding. Your daddy wouldn't have wanted you spending your whole life afraid." Before Mara could formulate a response to that, Thomas had wandered off toward a group of other old-timers, leaving her standing alone again. She made her way slowly through the crowd, nodding to people she recognized, accepting their surprised greetings with as much grace as she could manage. Some seemed genuinely pleased to see her, Others looked confused, like they couldn't quite place how Mara Ellison fit into their mental map of the evening's entertainment. She bought a cup of cider, actual cider, not Thomas Burke's variety, and found a relatively quiet spot near the edge of the square where she could watch the festivities without being directly part of them. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the bruised color before the dust storm. Lanterns were being lit. The music was getting louder as the musicians got drunker. People were starting to dance in the cleared space in front of the stage. Mara watched it all and felt like an anthropologist observing a culture she'd read about but never quite understood. "You came." She turned so fast she nearly spilled her cider. Gideon stood beside her, appearing as silently as he did everything else. He'd cleaned up for the occasion. His hair was combed back, his face freshly shaved, his clothes nicer than the rough work gear she'd seen before. But he still looked profoundly uncomfortable, like a wolf forced into a dog's collar. "You came too," Mara said. "Said I would." He glanced at the crowd, then back at her. "You want to leave?" "I just got here." "That's not what I asked." Mara looked at the festival, then at Gideon, then back at the festival. Did she want to leave? Yes, desperately. But she'd spent 3 years leaving, avoiding, hiding. Maybe it was time to try something different. "No," she said. "I want to stay. For a while at least." Gideon nodded. Then, to her complete surprise, he held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said. It wasn't a request. Wasn't quite a command either, just a statement of intent, offered for her to accept or refuse. Mara stared at his outstretched hand. It was scarred, she noticed. Old injuries poorly healed, the kind you got from years of hard living in unforgiving places. "I'm not very good," she said. "Neither am I." She took his hand. His grip was warm, rough with calluses, and gentle in a way that made her throat tight. He led her to the edge of the dancing area, not quite joining the main crowd but not hiding either, and pulled her into a simple waltz position. They moved together awkwardly at first, both of them too aware of their bodies and the music and the people who were definitely watching now. But after a few moments, something settled. Their rhythms synchronized. Gideon's hand on her waist was steady, and Mara found herself relaxing into the movement, following his lead without thinking about it. "Why did you really come tonight?" Mara asked quietly. Gideon's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Because you asked me to." "That's all?" "No." He was quiet for a moment, navigating them around another couple. "Because I'm tired of being alone on that mountain, and because you looked at my wooden bird like it was something valuable instead of a piece of junk carved by a man with too much time and no skill." Mara felt her chest constrict. "It is valuable. To you, maybe." "Yes," she said firmly. "To me." They danced in silence for a while, and Mara became aware that the crowd's attention had shifted slightly. People were watching them now, the baker girl and the mountain hermit, moving together like they'd been doing this for years instead of minutes. She waited for the anxiety to hit, for the familiar fear of being perceived, being judged, being made into a story people would tell. It didn't come. Maybe because Gideon was holding her like she mattered. Maybe because for the first time in her life, Mara didn't care what Red Flint thought about her choices. Or maybe because she was just too tired of being afraid to maintain the fear any longer. The song ended. They stepped apart, and Mara immediately felt the loss of his warmth. "Thank you," she said. Gideon nodded. Then, unexpectedly, "You hungry?" They got food from the vendors, roasted chicken and cornbread and apples, and found a place to sit away from the main crowd, on the steps of the shuttered bank building. They ate mostly in silence, but it was comfortable now, the quiet settling around them like a well-worn coat. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said eventually. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Fair enough." She took a breath. "Why did you help me that day? During the storm?" Gideon was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, "Because you looked like you needed help, and because I spent 10 years not helping anyone with anything, and I'm tired of that too." "Is that why you came back to town, after all this time?" "Partly." He picked at his cornbread, not eating it. "Mostly I came back because I saw you one day, outside your bakery. You were putting out your sign, and the wind caught it, and you spent 5 minutes fighting with the damn thing to get it positioned right. And you were laughing. Just a little, just to yourself, like it was funny instead of frustrating. And I thought—" He trailed off. "Thought what?" Mara prompted softly. "I thought I'd forgotten people could do that. Laugh at small things. Find something light in the middle of all the hard. Made me want to remember how." Mara's throat felt tight again. "Did it work? Have you remembered?" Gideon looked at her directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her feel exposed and seen and terrified and safe all at once. "Getting there," he said. They sat in silence after that, watching the festival continue without them. The music had shifted to something slower, couples swaying together in the lamplight. Children ran between the adults, high on sugar and late bedtimes. Somewhere someone was arguing about politics or poker debts, or something equally pointless. It was all so normal, so human, so far from the isolation Mara had wrapped around herself like armor. "I should go," she said, though she didn't move. "Should you?" "My stepfather expects me home by 10. It's barely 8. "I know." Mara stood anyway, brushing crumbs from her dress. "But if I stay much longer, I'll start thinking this is real, that this—" she gestured between them, "means something, and I can't afford to think that way." Gideon stood too, his height making her crane her neck to meet his eyes. "Why not?" "Because—" The word came out louder than she intended. Mara lowered her voice. "Because I've made that mistake before, thinking that someone paying attention to me meant they actually cared, and I can't survive being wrong about that again." "You're not wrong." Gideon's voice was rough, urgent. "Whatever you're thinking about me, about this, you're not wrong." "How do you know what I'm thinking?" "Because I'm thinking the same thing." He took a step closer. "I'm thinking that for the first time in 10 years, I don't want to go back to that empty cabin. I'm thinking that your bread tastes better than anything I've eaten in a decade because you made it for me specifically. I'm thinking that I spent 3 weeks carving that bird because I wanted to get it right for you, and I still think it's not good enough, but you kept it anyway." Mara's heart was hammering. "Gideon, I'm thinking," he continued, relentless now, "that you're scared because someone hurt you, and I'm scared because I loved people once and they died, and I swore I'd never put myself through that again. But here we are anyway, and I don't know what the hell to do about it except tell you the truth." "Which is?" Gideon reached out slowly, giving her time to move away. When she didn't, he cupped her face in one large, scarred hand. "The truth is that I see you, Mara Ellison. Not the girl Red Flint thinks you are. Not the victim, or the orphan, or whatever story they've decided to tell. I see the woman who fights with her bakery sign and laughs about it. Who bakes bread at 4 in the morning because that's when the work needs doing. Who keeps pine cones and rocks like they're precious because someone thought about her. That woman. That's who I see." Mara's breath came in short gasps. Tears were building behind her eyes, and she refused to let them fall. "And what if that woman doesn't exist?" she whispered. "What if I'm just pretending to be stronger than I am?" "Then we'll both pretend together." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "Because I'm pretending too. Pretending I'm not terrified. Pretending I know what I'm doing. Pretending that saying this out loud won't ruin everything. What if it does? Then at least we'll have tried." Someone shouted from the festival, a happy sound, celebration, nothing threatening. But Mara flinched anyway, the spell breaking. Gideon dropped his hand and stepped back, giving her space. "I should go," Mara said again. This time he didn't argue. "I'll walk you home." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." They walked through Red Flint's dark streets in silence, the sounds of the festival fading behind them. When they reached Harold's house, Mara stopped at the end of the walkway. "This is far enough," she said. Gideon looked at the house, really looked at it, taking in the peeling paint and broken steps and general air of neglect. His jaw tightened. "This where you live?" "It's where I stay," Mara corrected. "I live at the bakery. This is just where I sleep." "That man, your stepfather, he treat you well?" The question was casual, but Mara heard the edge beneath it. "He treats me like I'm an obligation he accepted when he married my mother," she said honestly. "Not cruel, just indifferent, like I'm furniture that came with the house." "That's its own kind of cruel," Mara shrugged. "It's better than some alternatives." Gideon looked like he wanted to say something else, but he swallowed it. The bread, he said instead. I want to keep trading with you, if you're willing. You don't have to bring me things for the bread. I'd give it to you anyway. I know, but I want to bring you things from the mountain, things I find that make me think of you. His voice softened. That all right? Mara nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. Gideon started to turn away, then paused. Mara? Yes? Next week, would you want to come up to the cabin, see where I live? Only if you're comfortable, he added quickly. I know it's asking a lot. Yes, Mara interrupted. I'd like that. Something bright flashed across Gideon's face. Surprise, pleasure, hope, all mixed together. Sunday afternoon? I'll meet you at the bakery. Sunday afternoon, Mara confirmed. He left then, disappearing into the darkness between street lamps, and Mara watched until she couldn't see him anymore. When she finally went inside, her mother was waiting in the kitchen, pretending to clean dishes that were already clean. You're home early, Sarah said, not looking up. The festival wasn't really my scene. No, I suppose it wouldn't be. Sarah set down her dish rag. Did you have a nice time anyway? It was the most personal question her mother had asked in months. Mara studied her, trying to figure out what had prompted it. I did, she said carefully. I danced and talked and ate too much cornbread. With anyone in particular? So they'd gotten to the real question. Does it matter? Mara asked. Sarah finally looked at her, and for a moment, Mara saw something raw in her mother's face. Regret, maybe, or fear, or the ghost of who she'd been before grief and desperation had worn her down. It matters if he's going to hurt you, Sarah said quietly. Everyone hurts everyone eventually, Mama. You taught me that. It came out harsher than Mara intended, but she was too tired to soften it. She kissed her mother's cheek, a brief, dutiful gesture, and went upstairs to her small room. She lay in bed for a long time, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about Gideon's hand on her face and the way he'd said her name. Like it meant something, like she meant something. And for the first time in 3 years, Mara let herself believe it might be true. Sunday came with agonizing slowness. Mara worked through the days in between with distracted efficiency, burning 2 batches of rolls and oversalting a rye loaf before finally accepting that her mind was 20 miles north on Iron Ridge instead of in her bakery where it belonged. Margaret Chen noticed, of course. You're humming, she observed on Friday morning, her tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious behavior. Am I? Mara wrapped the woman's bread without meeting her eyes. First time I've heard you make a sound that wasn't absolutely necessary in 3 years. Margaret counted out her change with deliberate precision. Must be something good on your mind. Just thinking about the weekend, Mara said, which was true enough. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then collected her parcels and headed for the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. Be careful, she said, and left before Mara could ask what exactly she was supposed to be careful of. Saturday dragged. Mara cleaned the bakery twice, reorganized her flour stores, and baked enough bread to feed half of Red Flint before finally accepting that busy work wasn't going to make time move faster. She closed early and walked home through streets that felt simultaneously too familiar and completely foreign. Harold was in the front room when she arrived, newspaper spread across his lap, glass of whiskey sweating onto the side table. You're home before dark, he said without looking up. That's new? I finished my work. Mara hung her bonnet carefully on its hook. Uh-huh. He turned a page. Your mother says you've been seeing someone. Mara's stomach clenched. I've been talking to someone. There's a difference. Not much of one, the way I see it. Harold finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. This the mountain man? Vale? Yes. He seems older than you. He is. And he lives alone up on the ridge like some kind of hermit. Yes. Mara kept her voice level. Is there a point to this conversation? Harold took a long drink of his whiskey. Point is that your mother worries. And when she worries, she makes my life difficult. So I'm asking, this man going to cause problems? What kind of problems? The kind where you end up pregnant and abandoned, or hurt, or disappeared. He said it flatly, like he was listing items on a grocery order. I've got enough to deal with without adding that kind of drama. Something cold settled in Mara's chest. I see. So your concern is entirely about your own convenience. My concern is keeping this household running smoothly. You're part of that household, whether either of us likes it much. So yeah, I need to know if this is going to blow up in everyone's face. It won't, Mara said, though she had no idea if that was true. All right then. Harold returned to his newspaper, dismissing her. Just remember, you make your choices, you live with the consequences. Don't expect me to clean up your messes. Mara climbed the stairs to her room, each step feeling heavier than the last. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, Harold's words circling in her mind like vultures. He wasn't wrong, exactly. She was making a choice, to trust Gideon, to believe in something fragile and new, to risk getting hurt again. And if it went badly, she'd have no one to blame but herself. The question was whether the possibility of something good was worth that risk. Mara thought about Gideon's hand on her face, the way he'd carved a bird for her with clumsy but genuine care, the absolute certainty in his voice when he'd said he saw her. Yes, she decided, it was worth it. Sunday morning arrived bright and cold, the kind of autumn day that promised winter wasn't far behind. Mara woke before dawn out of habit, then realized she had nowhere to be and nothing to do except wait. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, the dark green wool that brought out the color in her eyes, and braided her hair with more attention than usual. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone trying very hard to appear confident while being terrified underneath. Good enough. She went downstairs to find her mother already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through familiar motions. You're up early for a Sunday, Sarah said. I have plans. With him. It wasn't a question. Mara poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter. Yes, Mama. With him. Sarah cracked eggs into a pan, the sizzle filling the silence between them. I know I don't have much right to say this, she said finally. I know I haven't been much of a mother to you these past few years, but I need you to understand something. What's that? When your father died, I had choices. Not good ones, but choices. I could try to keep the house and the bakery and raise you on my own, probably fail at all of it, and end up with nothing. Or I could marry Harold, keep a roof over our heads, and accept that some things would be lost in the trade. Sarah flipped the eggs with practiced efficiency. I chose survival, and I've regretted it every single day since. Mara set down her coffee cup, her throat suddenly tight. Why are you telling me this? Because I see you making your own choice now. And I want you to know that choosing safety isn't always the same as choosing survival. Sometimes the safest choice is the one that kills you slowest. Sarah plated the eggs and finally looked at her daughter. Don't make my mistakes, Mara. Don't spend your life regretting the risks you were too afraid to take. It was the longest conversation they'd had in 3 years, and the most honest thing her mother had said to her since the funeral. I won't, Mara whispered. Sarah nodded and handed her the plate. Eat. You'll need your strength for climbing that mountain. Gideon arrived at the bakery precisely at noon, driving a wagon that had seen better days but was clearly well maintained. He helped Mara up to the seat without comment, then guided the horses north toward the ridge with steady competence. They rode in silence at first, the town falling away behind them as the land began to rise. The road, such as it was, became rougher, less traveled, until it was barely more than 2 wheel ruts through scrubland and scattered pine. How long have you lived up here? Mara asked eventually. 10 years this November. Gideon kept his eyes on the road. Bought the land right after I buried my family. Took me 2 years to build the cabin. Been there ever since. Do you ever get lonely? Every day? He said it matter-of-factly, like commenting on the weather. But lonely was better than the alternative for a long time. And now? Gideon glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. Now I'm not so sure. The cabin appeared gradually, emerging from between pine trees like it had grown there naturally. A solid structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It wasn't large, maybe 20 feet square, but it looked sturdy and well built, the kind of place that would stand for generations. You built this yourself? Mara asked as Gideon helped her down from the wagon. Most of it, Had some help with the roof beam, too heavy to manage alone. He led the horses to a small stable behind the cabin. It's not much, but it's mine. Mara walked slowly around the clearing, taking in the details. A vegetable garden, mostly harvested but still showing signs of careful tending. A workshop area with tools hung neatly on a wall. A fire pit surrounded by smooth stones. Everything organized with the precision of a man who lived alone and needed order to maintain sanity. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Gideon finished with the horses and joined her, looking at his property like he was seeing it through her eyes for the first time. "You think so?" "I do. It feels—" Mara searched for the right word. "Intentional. Like every piece was put exactly where it needed to be. That's all I've had for 10 years. Intention, purpose, something to build toward." He gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." The interior was as carefully organized as the exterior. One large room serving as kitchen, living area, and workspace, with a sleeping loft visible above. The furniture was simple but well made. A table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, shelves lined with books and carved wooden objects in varying stages of completion. And on the mantel above the fireplace, wrapped in the cloth she'd used to package them, sat every loaf of bread Mara had ever left for him. She stopped, staring. "You kept them," she said. Gideon followed her gaze. "Of course I kept them. They're yours." "They're stale by now, inedible." "Doesn't matter." He moved to the stove, filling a battered coffee pot with water. "They weren't really about the bread anyway, were they?" Mara felt her face heat. "I suppose not." They sat at his table drinking coffee that was stronger than anything Mara made, and she found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did around people. Maybe it was the isolation, no one to observe them, no audience to perform for. Or maybe it was just Gideon himself, solid and uncomplicated in a world that insisted on being neither. "Tell me about your family," Mara said, "if you want to." Gideon was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Her name was Catherine. We married young, barely 20. Had 2 children. Emma was 5, Thomas was 3. He stared into his coffee cup like reading tea leaves. "I was away checking the northern fence line when the raiders came. Drifters, probably. Looking for supplies, money, whatever they could take. Catherine tried to protect the kids. They killed all 3 of them anyway." Mara's chest constricted. "I'm so sorry." "I found them the next morning, already cold." His voice was flat, emotionless. The tone of someone reciting facts he'd repeated so many times they'd lost meaning. "Buried them under the oak tree by the creek. Sold the ranch the next week. Couldn't stand to stay there knowing what happened in that house." "So you came here?" "So I came here. Built this cabin where no one could find me. Figured I'd live out my days alone, punishing myself for not being there when they needed me." "It wasn't your fault," Mara said quietly. Gideon's laugh was bitter. "Intellectually, I know that. Emotionally." He shook his head. "I've spent 10 years trying to convince myself I didn't fail them. Haven't succeeded yet." "Is that why you helped me? During the storm?" "Partly." He finally looked at her. "Mostly I helped you because I've spent a decade telling myself I didn't deserve to be around people. That I'd just bring them pain. That the best thing I could do was disappear. And then I saw you fighting with that cart, refusing to give up even when any sane person would have, and I thought, maybe that's the wrong answer. Maybe isolating yourself isn't noble. Maybe it's just cowardice dressed up as sacrifice." Mara reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were rough, scarred, twice the size of hers. They closed around her hand carefully, like holding something fragile. "You're not a coward," she said. "Neither are you. But we've both been acting like we are, haven't we?" It was the most honest assessment of her life Mara had ever heard. She wanted to deny it, to defend herself, to explain all the very good reasons she'd built walls around her heart. Instead, she said, "Yes, we have." They sat like that, hands joined across his rough-hewn table, while afternoon light streamed through the window and dust motes danced in the air. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like water. A hawk called somewhere distant. "Stay for dinner," Gideon said. "I'll cook. It won't be fancy, but it'll be hot." "I should get back before dark." "I'll take you back after. I've got lanterns for the wagon." You'll be home safe, I promise. Mara knew she should say no, knew that staying longer would make leaving harder, knew that every moment she spent in this cabin was another moment she'd spend missing it when she left. She said yes anyway. Gideon cooked venison stew with vegetables from his garden, working with the same careful precision he applied to everything else. Mara helped where he had led her, chopping onions and setting the table, falling into an easy rhythm that felt dangerously domestic. They ate as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Gideon told her about his life on the ridge, hunting, building, the long winters when snow made the trip to town impossible. Mara told him about the bakery, about her father's dreams for the business, about the particular satisfaction of creating something with her own hands that brought people comfort. You love it, Gideon observed. The baking. I do. It's the one thing in my life that's entirely mine, that I'm good at, that no one can take away or diminish. Mara pushed vegetables around her bowl. Does that sound selfish? Sounds human. We all need something that's ours. After dinner, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the cooling air, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Up here, away from Red Flint's few lights, the night was spectacular. The Milky Way a river of light overhead, constellations sharp and clear. I'd forgotten how many stars there were, Mara said softly. Town blocks them out. Up here, you get the whole show. Gideon shifted in his chair. I come out here most nights. Reminds me how small everything is. How most of what we worry about doesn't matter at all in the grand scheme. Does that help? Thinking about how small we are? Sometimes. Other times it makes the loneliness worse. He was quiet for a moment. But tonight it feels different. Better. Like maybe being small isn't so bad if you're small together. Mara's breath caught. She turned to look at him, this massive, gentle man who'd survived more pain than anyone should have to bear, and somehow still had room in his heart to care about a baker he'd met during a dust storm. Gideon, she started. I know, he interrupted. I know this is fast. I know we barely know each other. I know 100 reasons why this is a terrible idea. He met her eyes. But I've spent 10 years being careful, being safe, keeping everyone at a distance so I wouldn't have to risk losing anyone again. And you know what I've learned? What? That the safest way to live is also the slowest way to die. He echoed her mother's words without knowing it, and Mara felt something shift in her chest. I don't want to die slowly anymore, Mara. I want to take the risk. I want to try, even knowing it might end badly, even knowing I might lose you like I lost them. You won't lose me, Mara said, though she had no right to make that promise. You can't know that. No, but I can choose it, every day, for as long as I have days to choose. She stood, letting the blanket fall, and moved to where Gideon sat. And I choose you. This, whatever this is or becomes, I choose it. Gideon pulled her down onto his lap, cradling her against his chest like something precious. His arms came around her, solid and warm, and Mara pressed her face into his shoulder and felt safe in a way she'd never felt in her entire life. I don't know how to do this, she whispered against his shirt. I don't know how to trust that it's real. Neither do I. His hand stroked her hair. So we'll figure it out together. Make mistakes together. Learn together. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the night, while the stars wheeled overhead and the wind sang through the pines. Eventually, reluctantly, Mara pulled back. I need to go home, she said. Gideon nodded and helped her stand, though his hands lingered on her waist for a moment before releasing her. I'll get the wagon ready. The ride back to Red Flint was quieter than the ride up had been, weighted with things said and unsaid. Gideon drove carefully, lanterns swinging from the wagon's corners, casting moving shadows across the road. As they approached town, Mara felt anxiety creeping back in, the real world reasserting itself after the timeless bubble of the cabin. When will I see you again? She asked. When do you want to see me? Tomorrow. Every day. All the time. The words spilled out before she could stop them. Gideon's hand found hers in the darkness. Then that's what we'll do. I'll come to town, help with deliveries, be around, if that's all right. It's more than all right, Mara squeezed his hand. But people will talk. Let them talk. I stopped caring what Red Flint thought about me 10 years ago. I wish I could stop caring. You will. Give it time. He pulled the wagon to a stop a block from Harold's house, far enough that they wouldn't be seen from the windows. Mara? Yes? That thing you said about choosing me. His voice was rough. Did you mean it? Every word. Gideon leaned down and kissed her, soft, careful, like he was afraid she might break. Mara kissed him back, pouring everything she couldn't say into the gesture, and felt him shudder against her. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to fall in love with you, he said, if I haven't already. Good, Mara whispered, because I'm already halfway there myself. She climbed down from the wagon and walked the remaining block to Harold's house, feeling Gideon's eyes on her until she was safely inside. Only then did she hear the wagon pull away, heading back toward the mountain. Mara leaned against the closed door and touched her lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss. Tomorrow, she thought. She'd see him tomorrow. The thought sustained her through the rest of that night and into the week that followed. Gideon kept his promise. He appeared at the bakery Monday morning, massive frame barely fitting through the door, and asked if she needed help with deliveries. When Mara said yes, trying to sound casual and failing completely, he loaded her cart with the efficiency of long practice and pushed it through Red Flint streets while she walked beside him. People stared. Of course they stared. But Gideon was right. Mara found she didn't care as much as she'd expected. Let them look, let them gossip, let them make up whatever stories they wanted about the baker and the mountain man. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any story. They'd found each other, and they were trying. That was all. That was everything. By Wednesday, Gideon's presence at the bakery had become routine enough that Margaret Chen stopped commenting on it. By Friday, even Harold had run out of passive-aggressive observations. The gifts continued, though they evolved. Gideon still brought her things from the mountain, interesting rocks, pressed flowers, a particularly beautiful piece of driftwood. But now he handed them to her directly, watching her face as she examined each offering. And Mara still baked for him. But now she did it while he sat at her work table, drinking coffee and whittling scraps of wood into small animals that lined up on her shelf like a growing menagerie. What are you making now? She asked one afternoon, looking over his shoulder at the piece of pine in his hands. Fox, I think. Or maybe a dog. Haven't decided yet. He made a careful cut, shaving away a sliver of wood. Whatever it wants to be. Does the wood tell you what it wants to be? Sometimes you learn to see what's already there, hiding inside. Then you just remove everything that isn't that. He held up the half-carved figure. Like baking bread, I imagine. The loaf's already there in the dough. You just have to coax it out. Mara thought about this while she kneaded rye dough, the rhythm meditative and familiar. I never thought about it that way, but yes, exactly like that. They worked in comfortable silence after that, creating their different arts in parallel, existing in the same space without needing to fill it with words. It was perfect, which meant, inevitably, that it couldn't last. The Autumn Festival's second weekend came faster than Mara expected. This time it was held at night, with a bonfire in the square and more drinking than the first celebration. Mara hadn't planned to go. She'd already pushed her social tolerance to its limits, but Gideon suggested they make an appearance just for an hour. People need to see us together, he said. See that this is real and not going away. Otherwise, the gossip will get worse instead of better. He was probably right. So Mara put on her blue dress again and let Gideon escort her through Red Flint streets to the square. The bonfire was already roaring when they arrived, sending sparks high into the night sky. People clustered around it in groups, talking and laughing with the looseness that came from shared alcohol and the relief of another harvest completed. Mara and Gideon found a spot on the periphery, not quite joining the crowd, but not hiding either. Several people nodded at them. Thomas Burke raised his cup in greeting. Margaret Chen offered a slight smile. Most just stared with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. Mara was learning to ignore the stares. They'd been there maybe 20 minutes when Jake Morrison appeared, clearly drunk, flanked by Ben Curtis and two other men Mara didn't recognize. Well, well, Jake said loudly enough to carry over the crowd noise. "Look who decided to grace us with their presence. Red Flint's newest couple." Mara felt Gideon tense beside her, his hand tightening slightly on her arm. "Evening, Jake," she said evenly. "Enjoying the festival?" "Oh, I'm having a great time. Even better now." Jake's smile was mean, his eyes unfocused. "Gotta say, Mara, I'm impressed. Didn't think you had it in you to bag someone. Even if he is old enough to be your father and crazy enough to live alone on a mountain like some kind of animal." "Walk away," Gideon said quietly. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact. Walk away or face consequences. Jake either didn't hear the warning or chose to ignore it. "What's the matter, old man? Can't handle a little conversation? Or are you too busy reliving the past? I heard about your family, sad story. But you know what's sadder? Using a lonely girl's desperation to feel less alone yourself." Mara opened her mouth to respond, but Gideon was faster. He didn't hit Jake, didn't threaten him, just stepped forward into the other man's space, using his considerable height advantage to loom in a way that made Jake stumble backward. "You want to insult me? Go ahead," Gideon said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've been called worse by better men. But you speak about her with respect, or you don't speak about her at all. Understand?" Jake's bravado faltered. For a moment, Mara thought he might actually back down. Then Ben Curtis laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, and Jake's face hardened. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Jake said. "You're just another fool who thinks this one's something special. But I know the truth. We all know the truth." He looked at Mara with contempt. "You're damaged goods, Mara Ellison. Always have been, always will be. And everyone in this town knows it." The words hit like physical blows. Mara felt her face burn, felt the old shame rising up despite everything she'd built in the past weeks. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear, wanted to prove Jake right by showing him exactly how broken she was. Instead, she felt Gideon's hand find hers and hold tight. "We're leaving," he said. "What?" Mara looked at him. "No, I'm not running away again. I'm tired of running." "Then we'll stay." Gideon kept his eyes on Jake. "But if we stay, I need you to understand that I will not be responsible for what happens if he keeps talking." The crowd had gone quiet now, everyone watching this drama unfold. Mara felt their attention like heat from the bonfire, consuming, inescapable. Jake opened his mouth to say something else, but Ben grabbed his arm. "Let it go, man," Ben muttered. "He's not worth it." "Neither is she," Jake shot back, shaking off his friend's grip. But he started to turn away, the moment diffusing. That's when someone in the crowd laughed, a woman's voice, sharp and deliberately cruel. Mara didn't see who it was, didn't need to. The sound was enough, the universal language of mockery, of people finding entertainment in someone else's humiliation. Something in her snapped. "You think this is funny?" Mara's voice came out louder than she'd intended, cutting across the square. "All of you. You think watching someone get torn down is entertainment?" The laughter stopped. "I have spent 3 years in this town being exactly what you wanted me to be," Mara continued, her voice shaking but growing stronger. "Quiet, invisible, grateful for scraps. I've taken your pity and your contempt and your complete indifference, and I've said thank you because that's what you expected. But I'm done. I'm done apologizing for existing. I'm done making myself small so you can feel bigger, and I'm done letting people like Jake Morrison define my worth." She turned to Jake, who was staring at her with shock that might have been satisfying if Mara had been capable of feeling anything except raw fury. "You want to know the truth?" she said. "The truth is that you're right. I am damaged. We all are. Every single person here has scars and breaks and pieces that don't fit together quite right anymore. The difference is that I'm not pretending mine don't exist. I'm not hiding behind cruelty and alcohol and making other people feel as small as I feel inside." Jake's face had gone red. "I didn't." "Yes, you did. You've been doing it since we were 16 years old, and you made me into a joke to impress your friends. And I let you. I let you because I thought maybe if I stayed quiet enough, disappeared enough, you'd all forget. But you don't forget, do you? Because you need someone to look down on. Someone to remind yourselves that at least you're not that pathetic." Mara's breath was coming in gasps now, her whole body shaking. Gideon's hand was still in hers, anchoring her, keeping her grounded. "Well, Here's your reminder, she said to the crowd at large. I'm pathetic. I'm lonely and scared and so desperate for connection that I fall for anyone who shows me basic human decency. And you know what? I don't care anymore. I don't care what you think of me or who you think I should be. I don't care about your approval or your pity or your judgment. I only care about one person's opinion, and he's standing right here beside me. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the bonfire seemed to quiet, as if the fire itself was waiting to hear what came next. It was Thomas Burke who finally broke it. About damn time, the old rancher said, raising his cup. Thomas Ellison would be proud of you, girl, standing up for yourself like that. A few other people murmured agreement, not many, but enough. Enough to remind Mara that not everyone in Red Flint was like Jake Morrison. Jake himself had gone pale, his earlier bravado completely deflated. He muttered something that might have been an apology and stumbled away into the darkness, his friends trailing behind him. Mara watched them go, feeling simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted. Can we leave now? She asked Gideon quietly. Yeah. His voice was rough with emotion. We can leave. They walked away from the festival, from the bonfire and the stairs and the whispered conversations that would undoubtedly continue long after they were gone. Gideon didn't take her to Harold's house or back to the bakery. Instead, he led her out of town entirely, following a path that climbed gradually toward the ridge. After 15 minutes of walking in silence, they emerged onto a small bluff overlooking Red Flint. The town looked small from here, its lights scattered like fallen stars across the dark prairie. I'm sorry, Mara said. I shouldn't have made a scene. Don't apologize. Gideon's voice was firm. Don't you dare apologize for finally standing up for yourself. But now everyone what? Knows you have a backbone? Knows you're not going to take their cruelty anymore? Good. Let them know. He turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. You were magnificent back there. I was angry. You were honest. There's a difference. His thumb brushed her cheek. You know what I realized while you were talking? What? That I've been protecting myself by not saying what I really feel, by holding back, being careful, treating this like something fragile that might break if I put too much weight on it. His gray eyes held hers. But you just stood in front of an entire town and declared yourself. The least I can do is match that courage. Mara's heart was pounding. Gideon, I love you, he said, simple and direct. I don't know when it happened. Maybe that first day in the storm, maybe when you kept my wooden bird, maybe 10 minutes ago when you took apart Jake Morrison with nothing but words. But I know it's true. I love you, Mara Ellison, not the version of you that this town sees, the real you. The brave, fierce, beautiful woman who bakes bread at 4 in the morning and fights with her sign and makes me believe that maybe I deserve to be happy again. Tears were streaming down Mara's face, hot and unstoppable. You can't know that. We barely know each other. It's too fast, too soon. It's exactly the right speed for us. Gideon cupped her face in both hands, thumbs wiping away tears. And I do know. I know, because for the first time in 10 years, I wake up excited instead of dreading the day. I know because I think about you constantly, what you're doing, whether you're safe, if you're smiling. I know because I would walk through fire for you without hesitation. That's not infatuation or loneliness or desperation. That's love. Mara's breath was coming in hitching gasps, caught between laughing and crying. I love you too, she whispered. I'm terrified and this is insane, and I love you so much it hurts. Gideon kissed her then, deep and thorough and claiming. Mara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had, pouring months of loneliness and years of pain and this impossible, terrifying joy into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon pressed his forehead to hers. No one will ever love you the way I do, he said roughly. No one will ever see you the way I see you. No one will ever protect you or cherish you or fight for you the way I will. I swear it, Mara. I swear it on everything I've lost and everything I've found. And standing on that bluff above Red Flint, wrapped in the arms of a man who had survived the worst life could offer and still had room in his heart to love her, Mara finally let herself believe it was true. The weeks that followed felt like living in a dream that Mara kept expecting to end. But it didn't end. Gideon came to town almost every day, helping with deliveries, sitting in the bakery while she worked, becoming such a fixture that people stopped staring and started accepting his presence as normal. They fell into patterns, small rituals that felt like building something permanent. Gideon would arrive at dawn and help her load the oven. Mara would pack him lunch for when he worked on projects around town, fixing Mrs. Chen's broken porch rail, helping Thomas Burke repair a fence, doing odd jobs for people who needed the help, but were too proud to ask directly. In the evenings, after the bakery closed, they would walk. Sometimes through red flint streets, sometimes out to the bluff, where Gideon had first said he loved her. Sometimes just in circles around the town square while they talked about everything and nothing. Mara learned that Gideon could identify every bird by its call, that he taught himself to read using his dead wife's books, that he still had nightmares about coming home to find his family gone. Gideon learned that Mara had wanted to be a teacher before her father died, that she sometimes baked in the middle of the night when anxiety made sleep impossible, that she'd never traveled more than 50 miles from Red Flint in her entire life. They learned each other piece by piece, scar by scar. And then, 3 weeks after the festival confrontation, Gideon disappeared. Mara noticed his absence immediately when he didn't show up at dawn. She told herself he'd overslept, or that something on the mountain needed attention. But when he didn't appear by mid-morning, anxiety began creeping in. By noon, she was genuinely worried. By evening, she was certain something was wrong. She closed the bakery early and walked to the general store, where the owner kept track of comings and goings with the efficiency of someone who considered gossip a public service. "Mr. Peterson," Mara said, trying to keep her voice level, "have you seen Gideon Vale today?" Peterson looked up from his ledger. "Vale? Yeah, saw him yesterday afternoon. Bought supplies and headed back up the mountain. Seemed in a hurry." "Why?" "No reason, just wondering." Mara forced a smile and left before he could ask more questions. She walked home in the gathering dusk, telling herself there were 100 reasonable explanations. He'd gotten busy with something on the ridge. He'd decided to take a day to himself. He'd simply forgotten. Except Gideon didn't forget, and he'd never left without telling her before. The next day brought no sign of him, or the day after that. By the fourth day, Mara was oscillating between worry and anger. Had something happened to him? Was he hurt? Or had he simply decided this was all too much, the scrutiny, the commitment, the weight of loving someone after swearing he never would, again? On the fifth day, she couldn't stand it anymore. She borrowed Thomas Burke's horse. The old rancher asked no questions, just handed her the reins and told her to be careful, and rode up the mountain road toward Gideon's cabin. The journey took 2 hours, the path steeper and rougher than she remembered from the wagon ride. By the time she reached the clearing, Mara's hands were cramped from gripping the reins, and her heart was pounding with equal parts exertion and dread. The cabin looked the same as it had before. Smoke rose from the chimney, so Gideon was home. Alive. Simply choosing not to come to town. Choosing not to see her. Mara dismounted, tied the horse to a post, and walked to the door. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it, suddenly unsure. What if he didn't want to see her? What if she'd misread everything, and his declaration of love had been a moment of emotion he now regretted? She knocked anyway. Footsteps inside. The door opened. Gideon looked terrible. His face was haggard, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He hadn't shaved in days, and his clothes were rumpled like he'd been sleeping in them. "Mara." His voice was rough. "What are you doing here?" "What am I—" Mara felt anger surge through her fear. "You disappeared. For 5 days. No word, no explanation, nothing. What did you think I'd do?" "I thought you'd understand that I needed space." "Space from what? From me?" Gideon's jaw tightened. "From all of it. The town. The expectations. The constant pressure of trying to be someone I'm not. I never asked you to be anyone except yourself." "I know." He looked away. "That's the problem." Mara stepped inside without being invited, forcing Gideon to move back. The cabin's interior was a mess. Unwashed dishes, scattered tools, general disarray that spoke of someone spiraling. "Talk to me," she said. Please, tell me what's happening." Gideon moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames. "I can't do this, Mara. I thought I could, but I can't." The words hit like a physical blow. Can't do what? This. Us. Love. He spat the last word like it was poison. Every day I wake up terrified that something's going to happen to you, that I'm going to lose you the way I lost them, that I'm going to come home one day and find you gone, and it's going to destroy me all over again. So your solution is to leave first? Mara's voice was shaking. To run away before you can get hurt? It's not running. It's surviving. I survived 10 years alone. I can survive the rest of my life the same way. That's not surviving, Gideon. That's dying slowly. You said it yourself. Maybe dying slowly is safer than dying all at once. He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it made Mara's chest ache. I can't survive losing you. I won't. So I'm making the choice now, while I still can. Mara felt tears building but refused to let them fall. You don't get to make that choice for both of us. I'm not. You're free to go back to town, live your life, find someone who isn't broken. I don't want someone who isn't broken. The words came out as a shout. I want you, scars and fear and all the messy, complicated parts. I want you exactly as you are. You say that now, but when something happens, and something always happens, you'll realize I'm not worth the pain. Stop telling me what I'll realize. Mara crossed the space between them, grabbing his arm. Stop deciding what I can and can't handle. I'm not Catherine. I'm not your children. I'm not some fragile thing that's going to break the moment you look away. I know that. Gideon's voice cracked. But knowing it doesn't change how I feel. Doesn't change the fact that every time you're out of my sight, I imagine the worst. Doesn't change the nightmares where I lose you 100 different ways. Then we'll deal with the fear together. We'll figure out how to live with it. I've been trying to figure it out for 5 days, Mara. And all I keep coming back to is that the only way to guarantee I don't lose you is to never have you in the first place. Mara pulled her hand back like he'd burned her. So that's it? You love me, but you're too scared to actually be with me? Yes, he said it flatly. I'm a coward. You deserve better. I deserve honesty. I deserve a partner who fights for us instead of running the moment things get hard. She was crying now, hot, angry tears that she couldn't stop. And you know what else I deserve? I deserve to make my own choices about my own life. And I choose to risk getting hurt. I choose to take this chance. The question is whether you're brave enough to do the same. Gideon turned back to the fire. I'm not. I'm sorry, but I'm not. Mara stood there for a long moment, waiting for him to turn around, to take it back, to fight for them the way she was fighting. But he remained motionless, shoulders rigid, radiating finality. Fine, she said quietly. You want to be alone? You've got your wish. She walked out of the cabin, untied the horse, and mounted with shaking hands. Only when she was on the horse's back did she look back at the cabin one more time. Gideon stood in the doorway, watching her leave. Even from a distance, she could see the devastation on his face. This is what dying slowly looks like, Mara called to him. I hope it's worth it. Then she turned the horse toward town and rode away, tears streaming down her face, her heart shattering with every step that took her farther from the man she loved. The ride back to Red Flint was a blur. Mara returned Thomas Burke's horse, thanked him through a tight throat, and walked back to the bakery in the dark. She let herself in, locked the door behind her, and finally let herself collapse. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. She baked instead, working through her inventory with mechanical precision, creating loaf after loaf that she had no energy to sell. The physical work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, but it didn't stop the pain. Harold noticed her state when she came home the second night, eyes red and movement sluggish. The mountain man leave you? He asked, not unkindly. Something like that. Figures. Men like that don't change. They just find new ways to stay broken. He took a drink of his whiskey. You'll get over it. Mara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd given up on everything except comfort and routine. A man who'd chosen safety over joy so many times he'd forgotten what joy felt like. No, she said. I don't think I will. She went upstairs and lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, and made a decision. She wasn't going to get over Gideon Vale. She wasn't going to accept his fear as an ending, and she sure as hell wasn't going to let him die slowly on that mountain while she died slowly in this town. If he wouldn't fight for them, She'd fight enough for both of them. The next morning, Mara opened the bakery at her usual time. She baked her usual inventory. She served her usual customers with her usual efficiency. But when Margaret Chen came in for her order, Mara said something she'd never said before. "Mrs. Chen, do you believe in second chances?" Margaret paused, bread halfway into her basket. "Depends on what kind of chances we're talking about. The kind where you risk everything for something that might not work out, where you put your heart on the line even knowing it could break." "Ah." Margaret set down her basket. "We're talking about Gideon Vale. We're talking about being brave enough to want something, even when wanting it is terrifying." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew. Not because he didn't get scared, he got scared plenty, but because he never let fear make his decisions for him. He wanted your mother, wanted you, wanted this bakery, and he fought for all of it, even when it was hard. I barely remember him being scared. That's because he got good at hiding it. But I remember when you were born, he was terrified, convinced he'd be a terrible father, that he'd let you down somehow. Your mother had to talk him through it, remind him that love was worth the risk." Margaret's expression softened. 9 months later, he was the most devoted father I'd ever seen, because he chose to be brave. Mara felt something settle in her chest. "Thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me what bravery actually looks like." The first snow came early that year, arriving in late October with a fury that caught everyone off guard. Mara watched through her bakery window as red flint transformed into something almost beautiful under the white blanket. Sharp edges softened, ugliness hidden. She thought about Gideon constantly, wondered if he was warm enough, if he had enough supplies, if he was eating properly. Wondered if he thought about her too, or if he'd managed to convince himself that pushing her away had been the right choice. She'd given him 2 weeks. 2 weeks to sit alone on that mountain and realize what he'd given up. 2 weeks to come to his senses and come back to her. When the 2 weeks passed with no sign of him, Mara decided it was time to take action. She spent 3 days preparing, baking enough bread to last Gideon through the winter, packing supplies, planning what she'd say when she saw him again. On the 4th day, she borrowed Thomas Burke's horse again and made the journey up the mountain through freshly fallen snow. The cabin looked smaller somehow, hunched against the winter wind. No smoke rose from the chimney, which sent Mara's heart into her throat. She dismounted quickly and pounded on the door. No answer. She tried the handle. Locked. "Gideon!" She hammered harder. "I know you're in there. Open the door." Silence. Mara stepped back, looking around the clearing. His horse was in the stable, so he had to be home. Unless something had happened, unless he was hurt or sick or... She forced herself to breathe. Then she walked around to the back of the cabin where she remembered seeing a window. It was shuttered from the inside, but the shutters were old wood, and determination was a powerful thing. It took her 10 minutes to pry the shutter open enough to climb through. She dropped into the cabin's interior with less grace than she'd hoped, landing hard on her shoulder. The cabin was freezing, dark, and completely empty. Not empty of furniture, that was all still there, empty of Gideon. Mara stood in the silent cabin, breathing hard, and noticed something on the table. A note, weighted down with the fossil stone he'd given her weeks ago. Her hands shook as she picked up the paper. "Mara," it read in Gideon's rough handwriting. "I've gone to stay with a friend in Cooperton until spring. The cabin's yours if you want it. I've left instructions for winterizing it properly. I'm sorry I couldn't be what you needed. I'm sorry I let you down. You deserve someone braver than me. Be well. G." Mara read it 3 times, fury building with each pass. He'd run. Actually run. Abandon not just her, but his home, his mountain, everything he'd built, because he was too afraid to risk being happy. And he thought leaving her the cabin was some kind of gift? Some consolation prize for the relationship he was too cowardly to fight for? She crumpled the note in her fist and looked around the cabin with new eyes. Saw the careful organization, the handmade furniture, the books on shelves, the life Gideon had constructed out of grief and solitude. A life he'd just abandoned rather than let someone in. Mara made a decision. She spent the next hour winterizing the cabin using Gideon's detailed instructions, banking the fire, covering windows, securing shutters. Then she locked the door from the outside, took the key, and rode back to Red Flint. She didn't cry this time. She was done crying over Gideon Vale. November turned to December. The snow kept falling, and Red Flint settled into its winter routine. Mara worked, baked, existed, but she didn't give up. She wrote letters, long, honest letters about her day, her thoughts, her feelings, and had them sent to Cooperton in care of Gideon Vale. She had no idea if he read them, had no idea if he even picked them up from the post office, but she wrote them anyway, because giving up would mean accepting Gideon's fear as truth, and Mara refused to do that. The Winter Festival came in mid-December, a smaller affair than the autumn celebration, but still an excuse for Red Flint to gather and pretend the cold wasn't quite so brutal. Mara attended alone, forcing herself to be visible, to refuse to hide away just because Gideon had. She was standing by the punch bowl when Sarah approached, the first time her mother had sought her out in public in years. "Mara, could we talk?" They found a quiet corner, away from the music and celebration. "I've been a terrible mother to you," Sarah said without preamble. "Since your father died, I've been so focused on my own grief and fear that I forgot you were grieving too. And I'm sorry." Mara blinked, surprised. "Mama, let me finish." Sarah's hands twisted together. "I heard what happened with the mountain man, that he left. And I saw how you haven't let it destroy you. You're still working, still standing, still fighting, and I realized that somewhere along the way you became braver than I ever was. I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm barely holding together. That's what bravery looks like most of the time." Sarah touched Mara's cheek gently. "Your father would be so proud of who you've become, and I'm proud too. I should have said that a long time ago." Mara felt tears building. "Thank you. I know I can't undo the last 3 years, can't give you back the mother you needed, but I can try to do better from here." Sarah's voice cracked. "If you'll let me." Mara pulled her mother into a hug, and Sarah held her tight, and for the first time since Thomas Ellison died, they grieved together instead of alone. The night of December 23rd, everything changed. Mara was closing the bakery when she heard shouting from down the street. She stepped outside to see people running, saw the orange glow against the night sky, and felt her stomach drop. Fire! She ran toward the commotion, following the crowd to the western edge of town where Harold's house stood, or where it had stood. The entire structure was engulfed in flames, fire pouring from windows and eating through the roof. People were trying to organize a bucket brigade, but it was clear the house was lost. "Where's my mother?" Mara grabbed the nearest person. "Where's Harold?" "Inside still, I think. And the kids?" Mara didn't hear the rest. She was already running toward the burning house, pushing through people trying to hold her back. "You can't go in there," someone shouted. But Mara wasn't listening. Her mother was in there. Her half-siblings, Harold's children from his first marriage who lived with them. They were all inside and no one was doing anything except watching the building burn. She made it to the porch before strong arms wrapped around her waist and hauled her backward. "Let me go!" She fought against the grip. "My family's in there. And you'll die if you go in." The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it through her panic. Then someone else came running from the direction of Main Street, a massive figure moving with purpose through the crowd. Gideon. He'd come back. Mara didn't have time to process it because Gideon ran straight past her, straight toward the burning house, and disappeared into the flames without hesitation. The world went silent. Mara was screaming but couldn't hear herself over the roar of blood in her ears. She fought against whoever was holding her, desperate to follow Gideon, to stop him, to save him from the choice he was making. Because he was going to die. No one could survive that inferno. No one could. A figure appeared in the doorway, massive and backlit by fire. Gideon, carrying Harold's teenage son over his shoulder. He handed the boy to waiting hands and turned back into the flames. "No!" Mara's voice finally worked. "Gideon, no!" But he was already gone. Seconds passed like hours. The crowd pressed closer. Someone was praying. Someone else was crying. Mara stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to do anything except watch the doorway and will Gideon to come back out. He emerged again, this time with Harold's daughter, set her down carefully, turned back. "The house is coming down," someone yelled. "He needs to get out now!" But Gideon went back in anyway. The roof groaned, a sound like the earth splitting. Part of the second floor collapsed inward, sending sparks and debris shooting into the night sky. Mara broke free from whoever was holding her and ran toward the house. Strong hands grabbed her again, multiple people this time, holding her back while she fought and screamed and begged. "Please," she sobbed. "Please, someone stop him! Please!" The front wall buckled, and Gideon came through it carrying two people, Sarah, unconscious, and Harold, barely conscious. He made it 5 feet from the porch before his legs gave out, and all three of them went down. The crowd surged forward. Someone pulled Sarah away. Someone else grabbed Harold, and Mara finally broke free and reached Gideon just as the house collapsed completely behind him, flames reaching toward the stars. He was burned, badly. His coat had caught fire in places, his face was blistered, and he was coughing hard enough that Mara could see it hurt. "You idiot!" she sobbed, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch and cause more pain. "You stupid, brave, idiotic man!" Gideon looked at her through eyes that were already swelling shut. "Had to," he rasped. "Couldn't let you lose them, not when I could stop it. You almost died. Better than watching you hurt." He coughed again, and blood flecked his lips. "I'm sorry. For leaving. For being scared. For all of it. I'm so sorry. Stop talking. Save your strength." Mara looked up at the crowd. "Someone get the doctor. Now!" But even as people scattered to follow her orders, Mara knew it might already be too late. Dr. Hollis arrived within minutes, his medical bag already in hand like he'd anticipated disaster. The crowd parted to let him through, and he dropped to his knees beside Gideon with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd seen his share of catastrophes. "Get him to my office," Hollis ordered, already examining the burns. "Carefully, and someone bring clean water and bandages." 4 men lifted Gideon as gently as they could, but Mara saw the pain that crossed his face despite his efforts to hide it. She followed the makeshift stretcher through red flint streets, her hand gripping Gideon's despite the burns there, refusing to let go. Behind them, the remains of Harold's house collapsed completely, sending a final pillar of sparks into the winter sky. The doctor's office was small and cramped with 6 people inside it: Hollis, his assistant, Mara, and 3 men who'd helped carry Gideon. Hollis worked quickly, cutting away burned clothing, assessing damage, his face growing grimmer with each discovery. "The burns are serious," he said, not looking at Mara. "2nd degree on his arms and chest, possible smoke inhalation. I need everyone out except my assistant." "I'm staying," Mara said. "Miss Ellison?" "I'm staying." Her voice left no room for argument. Hollis looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fine, but stay out of my way." The next 2 hours were the longest of Mara's life. She watched Hollis clean and dress burns, listened to Gideon's labored breathing, held his uninjured hand while he drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point, someone brought news that Sarah and Harold's children were being cared for at the boarding house. Shaken, but alive, thanks to Gideon. Harold himself had suffered smoke inhalation, but would recover. Everyone would recover, except possibly Gideon, and that thought made Mara's chest constrict until she couldn't breathe. "He's stable," Hollis said finally, wiping his hands. "For now. The next 24 hours will tell us if there's infection or complications from the smoke. He needs rest, fluids, and constant monitoring." "I'll stay with him," Mara said immediately. "He can't be moved tonight. I've got a recovery room in back. Then I'll stay there." Hollis studied her with tired eyes. "You understand he might not make it, even with everything I've done?" "He'll make it." Mara said it with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. He survived 10 years alone on that mountain. He survived losing everyone he loved. He'll survive this. "Hope's not medicine, Miss Ellison." "No, but it's something." She looked at Gideon's unconscious form, bandaged and broken but still breathing. "And right now it's all I have to give him." Hollis showed her to the recovery room, barely more than a closet with a cot, where they'd moved Gideon. Mara pulled a chair close to the bed and settled in, taking his hand again, feeling the heat of fever already building under bandages. She talked to him through that first night, told him about the bakery, about her mother's apology at the festival, about all the letters she'd written that he'd probably never read. She told him she loved him, that she wasn't giving up, that he needed to fight because she couldn't do this without him. At some point near dawn, his eyes fluttered open. Mara? His voice was barely a whisper, roughened by smoke. I'm here. She leaned closer. I'm right here. Did everyone make it out? Everyone's alive because of you, my mother, Harold, the kids. All alive. Gideon's eyes closed again, something like relief crossing his battered face. Good. Why did you come back? Mara asked softly. You'd left. Gone to Cooperton. Why did you come back tonight? Never left. He coughed, and Mara helped him sip water. Couldn't make myself go more than 5 miles before I turned around. Been staying at Thomas Burke's ranch, working for him in exchange for a room. Couldn't stay away from you, but I was too much of a coward to face you. Mara felt tears building. You read my letters? Everyone. Read them so many times I have parts memorized. His hand tightened weakly on hers. You said you'd wait. Said you weren't giving up on me, even if I'd given up on myself. Is that still true? Yes, you idiot. Of course it's still true. Then I have something to say. Gideon's eyes opened again, focusing on her with effort. I was wrong. About everything. About thinking I could protect myself from pain by pushing you away. About believing that loving you meant losing you. About being too scared to choose happiness. Gideon, let me finish, please. He drew a shaky breath. When I saw that house burning and knew you'd try to go in, I understood something. The pain of losing you wouldn't come from death or disaster or any of the things I've been afraid of. It would come from my own cowardice, from choosing to lose you slowly instead of risking having you completely. Mara was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe the tears away. I ran into that fire because the idea of you grieving your family was unbearable. But more than that, I ran in because I wanted to be the man you deserve, the one who fights instead of runs, the one who's brave enough to match your courage. His voice cracked. I love you, Mara Ellison. I want to marry you, build a life with you, give you everything I have and everything I am. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to be worthy of the faith you've had in me. You're already worthy, Mara whispered. You've always been worthy. Then marry me. Not when I'm healed, not when things are easier, not when I can give you a proper proposal. Right now, burned and broken in a doctor's office in the middle of the night. Marry me, Mara. Mara laughed through her tears. Yes, yes, of course, yes. Gideon's smile was painful to see on his blistered face, but it was genuine. You're sure? I'm offering you a hard life. A cabin on a mountain, isolation, winters that'll test your resolve, and a man who'll probably always carry some fear. I don't want an easy life. I want you. All of you. Fear and scars and everything in between. She leaned down carefully and pressed her forehead to his. We'll be scared together. We'll face the hard things together. And we'll build something beautiful anyway. I don't deserve you. Good thing I'm not asking for deserving. I'm asking for forever. Gideon's eyes were already closing again, exhaustion and medication pulling him under. Forever, he murmured. I can do forever. Mara stayed by his bedside through that day and into the next night. Dr. Hollis checked on them regularly, changing bandages, monitoring for infection, his expression gradually shifting from concern to cautiously optimistic. Sarah came to visit on the second day, still moving stiffly from her own ordeal, but alive and whole. Mama. Mara stood, and Sarah pulled her into a fierce hug. I thought I'd lost you, Sarah said into her daughter's hair. When I saw you trying to run into that house, I thought I'd lost you too. They held each other for a long moment before Sarah pulled back and looked at Gideon's sleeping form. He saved my life, she said quietly. Saved all of us. I saw him coming through that smoke and fire like some kind of avenging angel, and I knew this is the man my daughter loves. This is the one worth fighting for. He asked me to marry him, Mara said. Sarah's face transformed. And you said yes. I said yes. Good. Sarah squeezed Mara's hand. Your father would approve. He always said the measure of a man wasn't in how he acted when things were easy, but in what he did when everything was falling apart. This man, she gestured to Gideon, He ran into a burning building for people he barely knew, for the family of the woman he loves. That's the kind of man who'll stand by you through anything. Over the next week, Gideon healed slowly but steadily. The burns began to close, his breathing improved, and Dr. Hollis finally declared him out of danger. Red Flint's response to what had happened was complex. Some people, the ones who'd always been kind, brought food and supplies, offered help rebuilding, expressed genuine gratitude for Gideon's heroism. Others remained suspicious, calling him reckless, questioning his motives, suggesting that running into a burning building was more evidence of instability than bravery. Mara stopped caring what they thought. Harold, recovering from his own smoke inhalation, came to see them on Gideon's 8th day in the doctor's care. "I owe you my life," Harold said without preamble, standing awkwardly at the foot of the bed. "And my children's lives. I don't have words for that kind of debt." "You don't owe me anything," Gideon said. "I did what anyone would do." "No. You did what almost no one would do." Harold looked uncomfortable, like gratitude was a foreign language he was learning to speak. "I haven't been good to Mara. Haven't been the father she needed after Thomas died. But I want you to know, you take care of her, you'll have my respect. And my support, for whatever that's worth." It wasn't an apology exactly, but coming from Harold, it was close enough. "I plan to take care of her for the rest of my life," Gideon said. "You have my word on that." Harold nodded and left, and Mara felt something release in her chest, some knot of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. By the end of January, Gideon was well enough to leave the doctor's care. The burns had healed to angry red scars that would fade with time, and his strength was returning daily. Mara had moved her essential belongings from Harold's house to a room at Margaret Chen's boarding house, where she stayed while Gideon recovered. On the first day of February, they stood together in the bakery, planning their future. "The cabin needs work before we can live there full time," Gideon said, studying a list he'd been making. "Proper insulation for winter, expansion of the living space, a better kitchen setup for you. We can do it together. I can help." "I know you can, but I also know you love this bakery." He gestured around the small space. "I'm not asking you to give it up." "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to split time. Spring through fall, we work the bakery, live in town or close enough. Winter, when business is slower anyway, we go up to the cabin. Best of both worlds." Mara considered this. It was more than she'd hoped for, a compromise that honored both her work and their desire for the mountain's peace. "What about your work? The jobs you do around town?" "I can do those year-round, and in winter I'll have projects at the cabin. Furniture to build, improvements to make." He pulled her close, careful of his healing burns. "I'm not trying to control your life, Mara. I'm trying to build a life that works for both of us." "I love you," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him carefully. "I love you too, which is why I want to marry you before we do anything else." Gideon's expression turned serious. "I know we should probably wait until spring, have a proper ceremony." "I don't want to wait," Mara was certain. "I don't need a big ceremony or a fancy dress or half of Red Flint watching. I just need you and me and someone to make it legal." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They were married 3 days later at the small church on the edge of town, with Thomas Burke and Margaret Chen as witnesses. Sarah attended, crying quietly throughout, and even Harold showed up, standing in the back with his children. Mara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Gideon had somehow found despite the winter cold. Gideon wore his best clothes and looked at Mara like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. The ceremony was brief. The minister spoke about commitment and faith and building a life together through good times and bad. Mara barely heard the words. She was too focused on Gideon's face, on the way his hand shook slightly when he slid the simple gold band onto her finger, on the absolutely certainty in his eyes when he said, "I do." When the minister pronounced them married, Gideon kissed her with a gentleness that made her chest ache, and Mara felt something fundamental shift in the universe. She was no longer Mara Ellison, the baker's daughter, the orphan, the girl Red Flint pitied. She was Mara Vale, and that name felt like coming home. The reception was held at Margaret Chen's boarding house, a simple affair with food, music from a borrowed phonograph, and enough people to make it feel like a celebration without being overwhelming. Mara danced with her new husband, with Thomas Burke, even with Harold, who managed to smile and tell her she looked beautiful. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Sarah pulled Mara aside. "I have something for you." She handed Mara a small wooden box. "It was your father's. He made me promise to give it to you when you married someone worthy of you." Inside the box was a hand-drawn map of Red Flint and the surrounding area, dated 23 years earlier. On it, Thomas Ellison had marked various locations with notes in his careful handwriting. The bakery was labeled, "Where I'll Build Our Dream." The house was, "Where We'll Raise Our Daughter." And up on Iron Ridge, he'd drawn a small cabin and written, "Where she'll find peace someday, if she's lucky." Mara's hands trembled. "He drew this before I was born. Your father believed in signs, believed that some things were meant to be, written in the stars or the land or wherever these things get decided." Sarah touched the map gently. "He used to say that the mountains called to certain people, and when they answered, they'd find what they were looking for. I think he knew you'd end up there eventually." I wish he could have met Gideon. He'd have loved him, for his strength, yes, but more for his gentleness, for the way he looks at you like you hung the moon. Sarah's voice wavered. "Be happy, Mara. Be everything I was too afraid to be." They spent their wedding night in Mara's room at the boarding house, lying in the narrow bed wrapped in each other, talking quietly about the future. "We should go to the cabin soon," Gideon said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her back. "Start making it ours." "Tomorrow?" "You sure? We could take a few days, settle things here first." "I'm sure. The bakery can wait. Red Flint can wait. I want to start our life together now, not when it's convenient." Gideon kissed the top of her head. "Then tomorrow it is." They left Red Flint at dawn, their belongings packed into Gideon's wagon, along with enough supplies to last several months. Sarah and Harold stood on the boarding house porch to see them off, and Mara was surprised by the tears in her mother's eyes. "Come visit when the road's clear," Sarah called. "I want to see this cabin that's stolen my daughter." "It hasn't stolen me, Mama. It's just given me a place to grow into who I'm supposed to be." The journey up the mountain took most of the day. Snow still covered the road in places, but Gideon navigated it with practiced ease. As they climbed higher, Red Flint disappeared behind them, and Mara felt the weight of the town's expectations and judgments sliding away like a shed skin. The cabin appeared just as the sun was setting, its windows catching the last light and glowing like something out of a dream. Gideon helped Mara down from the wagon, and together they stood in the clearing looking at what would now be their home. "It needs work," Gideon said. "Lots of work. Expansion, better insulation, a proper kitchen for your baking." "It's perfect," Mara interrupted, "exactly as it is." They spent that first night making the cabin theirs, arranging furniture, unpacking belongings, building a fire that filled the space with warmth and light. Later, lying together in the sleeping loft with the wind singing through the pines outside, Mara felt a peace she'd never known. "No regrets?" Gideon asked quietly. "Not a single one. You?" "Just that it took me so long to get here. To you. We got here eventually. That's what matters." Spring came slowly to Iron Ridge, revealing itself in increments, snow melting to expose brown earth, the first brave shoots of green pushing through the soil, birdsong returning to the morning chorus. Mara and Gideon worked together to expand the cabin, adding a room that would serve as both kitchen and workspace where Mara could bake when inspiration struck. They fell into rhythms. Gideon would hunt and trap and maintain their small homestead. Mara would bake, though now it was for pleasure rather than obligation, creating loaves that she and Gideon would eat together or take as gifts when they visited Red Flint every few weeks. In April, Mara realized she was pregnant. She told Gideon one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for any sign of the fear she knew must be lurking underneath the joy. "A baby," he said, his hand moving to her still flat stomach with something like wonder. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you scared?" Mara asked. "Terrified. Absolutely terrified." His eyes met hers. "But also happier than I have any right to be. A child, Mara. Our child. A chance to do it right this time, to be the father I couldn't be before. You were a father before. A good one. from everything you've told me. I was a father who failed to protect his children. You were a father who loved his children and lost them to violence you couldn't control. There's a difference. Mara took his hand. And you'll be a wonderful father to this child. I know it. How can you be so sure? Because I've watched you build this life with me, watched you fight your fear every single day, watched you choose courage over safety, love over isolation, hope over despair. That's the kind of father this baby needs. Gideon pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I'm going to do everything in my power to keep you both safe. I know. But you also have to trust that we'll be okay. That life can be good even when it's uncertain. They prepared for the baby together, expanding the cabin further to add a small nursery, accumulating the supplies they'd need, making plans for when Mara would need to be closer to Dr. Hollis in Red Flint. As summer arrived and Mara's pregnancy became visible, they made the decision to spend more time in town. Gideon found work helping to rebuild Harold's house, which was rising from its ashes larger and sturdier than before, and Mara reopened the bakery part-time, baking when she had energy and resting when she didn't. Red Flint had changed in subtle ways. People who'd once looked at Mara with pity now looked at her with something closer to respect. Her confrontation at the festival, combined with Gideon's heroism during the fire, had shifted the town's narrative about both of them. They were no longer the objects of gossip or pity. They were simply Mara and Gideon Vale, the couple from Iron Ridge who'd chosen each other against all odds and made it work. Margaret Chen summed it up one morning when she came in for her bread. You know what I admire most about you two? She said, not waiting for an answer. You didn't wait for permission to be happy. Didn't wait for the town to approve or circumstances to be perfect. You just decided what you wanted and fought for it. Takes courage to do that. In October, as the leaves turned gold and the air took on winter's edge, Mara went into labor. It lasted 18 hours, long enough that Mara understood in a visceral way why women feared childbirth, why men paced outside delivery rooms, why bringing new life into the world was simultaneously the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing humans did. Gideon stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement when she was sure she couldn't continue. And finally, just after dawn on October 15th, their daughter was born. She was tiny, red-faced, and loudly indignant about her sudden eviction from the warm darkness she'd known. Dr. Hollis cleaned her carefully, wrapped her in a soft blanket, and placed her in Mara's arms while Gideon looked on with an expression of absolute wonder. She's perfect, he breathed. She's ours, Mara corrected, touching the baby's impossibly small fingers. They named her Catherine Emma Vale. Catherine for Gideon's first wife, Emma for his first daughter. Names that carried grief but also honored love that had existed before, making space for it alongside the love that existed now. When they brought Catherine home to the cabin 2 weeks later, Gideon carried her through the doorway with the same careful reverence he'd shown Mara on their wedding night. Welcome home, little one, he said softly. This is where you'll grow up, where you'll learn to be strong and brave and kind, where you'll always be safe and loved. Mara watched her husband with their daughter and felt something fundamental settle in her chest. This was what peace looked like, not the absence of fear or pain or struggle, but the presence of love strong enough to face all of it. The first winter with Catherine was harder than Mara had anticipated. The baby woke every few hours to feed, cried with impressive volume when displeased, and required constant attention that left both parents exhausted. But there were moments of crystalline beauty, too. Catherine's first smile, appearing unexpectedly one morning while Gideon was changing her diaper. The way she would quiet immediately when Mara sang to her. The sight of Gideon rocking their daughter to sleep in the chair he'd carved with his own hands, his massive frame making the baby look impossibly tiny. In February, when Catherine was 4 months old, they had their first real scare. The baby developed a fever that spiked high enough to send them racing down the mountain to Dr. Hollis in the middle of a snowstorm. Mara held Catherine against her chest the entire ride, feeling her daughter's too hot skin, hearing her labored breathing, and understanding in a terrible way every fear Gideon had ever expressed about loving someone. Hollis examined Catherine quickly, diagnosed a respiratory infection, and began treatment with the calm efficiency that made him invaluable to Red Flint. "She'll be fine," he assured them after several tense hours. "Young, strong, fighting it well. Keep her warm, keep her hydrated, and the fever should break within 24 hours." It broke in 18 hours, and Catherine's first cry of hungry indignation after the fever broke was the most beautiful sound Mara had ever heard. Gideon held his daughter close, tears streaming down his face, and Mara understood that something had fundamentally changed. The fear hadn't disappeared, would probably never completely disappear, but Gideon had faced it and survived, had stared down the possibility of loss and come through the other side, still capable of loving, still capable of hoping. "I thought I was going to lose her," he said later, after Catherine had been fed and was sleeping peacefully. "Thought it was happening again, that I was being punished for daring to be happy. But you didn't lose her. She's fine. We're all fine. This time? But what about next time? The next fever or accident, or then we'll deal with it when it comes." Mara took his hand. "We can't control everything, Gideon. Can't prevent every possible disaster. All we can do is love each other as hard as we can for as long as we have. That has to be enough. What if it's not? Then we'll face that too, together." Spring returned to Iron Ridge, and with it came renewal. They expanded the garden, planted herbs and vegetables, added chickens to their small homestead. Catherine grew rapidly, becoming more alert and interactive, responding to their voices and touch with expressions that seemed impossibly sophisticated for someone so small. On a warm day in May, they took Catherine to the lake, where Gideon had first told Mara he loved her. They spread a blanket on the shore and let the baby feel grass under her tiny hands, watched her face transform with wonder at the sensation. "This is where it all changed," Mara said, looking out over the water. "Where we stopped being afraid and started being brave. Where I finally understood that loving you was worth any risk." Gideon picked up Catherine, holding her so she could see the lake. "And now we get to teach her the same thing. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to love anyway." As summer arrived, they settled into a pattern that felt sustainable. Weeks at the cabin interspersed with trips to Red Flint, where Mara would bake for a few days, and Gideon would take construction work. They were building something, not just a life, but a legacy, a way of being in the world that honored both their need for solitude and their connection to community. Sarah visited regularly, taking delight in her granddaughter with an enthusiasm that made up for years of emotional absence. Even Harold came once, awkward and formal but genuinely trying, bringing a hand-carved rattle he'd made himself. "She's beautiful," he said, looking at Catherine with something like wonder. "She has your father's eyes, Mara." It was the kindest thing Harold had ever said to her. The years that followed were not easy, no life is. But they were good. Gideon continued to struggle with anxiety, particularly when Catherine was sick or hurt. Mara sometimes felt the weight of isolation during long winters when the cabin was cut off from the world. They fought occasionally, usually about nothing important, and had to learn how to argue constructively instead of letting resentment fester. But they learned, they grew, they built. Catherine's first words were "Mama" and "Papa," spoken within days of each other, like she couldn't choose which parent she loved more. Her first steps happened on the cabin porch, Gideon catching her before she could tumble down the stairs. Her first attempt at helping Mara bake ended with flour absolutely everywhere, and laughter that echoed through the cabin for hours. On Catherine's third birthday, Mara stood on the cabin porch at sunset, watching Gideon play with their daughter in the clearing. He'd built her a swing, and she was demanding to be pushed higher, "Papa, higher," while he carefully obliged, his face alight with joy that had once seemed impossible. The mountains glowed pink and gold in the dying light. Birds called their evening songs. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not threatening, but simply existing, part of the landscape they called home. Mara thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago, scared, small, convinced that she was unworthy of love or happiness. That girl would have been terrified of this life, its remoteness, its risks, its complete deviation from what Red Flint expected. But that girl had found courage, had met a broken man in a dust storm and seen possibility instead of danger, had fought for love when every instinct screamed to run, had chosen bravery over safety again and again, until courage became less a choice and more a way of being. "Mama, come swing!" Catherine's voice cut through her reverie. Mara walked down the porch steps and across the clearing to her family. Gideon caught her around the waist and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple, while Catherine giggled and demanded attention. "Happy?" he asked quietly. Mara looked at their daughter, bright-eyed and fearless, looked at the cabin they'd built together, made from logs and love and sheer stubborn determination, looked at the man who'd saved her in more ways than one, whose scars matched her own, whose courage had given her permission to be brave. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she said. And it was true. They'd both been broken, both been convinced that safety meant isolation, that the only way to protect themselves was to never let anyone close. They'd both spent years dying slowly, calling it survival, believing that was the best they could hope for. But they'd been wrong. Because standing in this clearing on Iron Ridge, with the mountains rising around them and their daughter's laughter filling the air, Mara understood what she'd once feared to believe, that wounded souls could heal, that love could grow in the hardest soil, that choosing courage over fear was the only way to truly live. They hadn't been saved by luck or fate or any grand design. They'd been saved by each other, by the simple, radical act of looking at someone else's broken pieces and saying, "Yes, this is worth fighting for." And that, Mara thought, as Gideon lifted Catherine onto the swing and she screamed with delight, was the best kind of salvation there was. The kind you built yourself, one brave choice at a time, until suddenly you looked around and realized you were home.